The morning sun had just begun to spill across the quiet street when Ethan stopped in front of the gates. They were tall and black, iron bars rising high like a barrier meant to keep people like him out. Beyond them stretched a different world. Green lawns cut to perfection, a long driveway lined with cars so polished the sunlight bounced off their windshields like glass. At the end of the drive stood the mansion, its stone walls calm and unshaken, as if untouched by loss. Ethan's shirt was wrinkled, his jeans worn thin at the knees. In his arms he clutched a folder, the edges bent and creased from how tightly he held it. He pressed it close to his chest, the way some people might hold onto a life vest. To anyone else, it was just paper. To Ethan, it was everything. His proof, his voice, his chance to finally be seen. He glanced around. A jogger passed on the sidewalk, earbuds in, giving him a quick look before continuing on without a word. Ethan stayed frozen where he was, his heart pounding. He had walked miles to get here, but now that he stood in front of the gate, his legs felt heavy, like they might give out beneath him. His mind drifted to his mother. He saw her again in that small apartment above the laundromat, tired after long shifts at the diner, still trying to smile when she tucked him in at night. She had never let him ask too many questions about his father, never let him hope for something more. But she also never told him the full truth. She had carried that secret until the end. Now Ethan carried it in his hands. He lifted his eyes back to the mansion, breathing in the sharp morning air. The family inside had never spoken his name. To them, he was nobody, but today he was done being nobody. The only question left was whether the people behind those gates were ready to face him, or if they would try, once again, to erase him. Long before Ethan ever stood at those gates, his life played out in a world that looked nothing like the one beyond them. He grew up in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, where the hum of machines ran day and night. The walls were thin, the paint chipped, and in winter the draft slipped through the windows no matter how many blankets they used. His mother worked double shifts at a diner on the edge of town. The smell of coffee and bacon seemed stitched into her uniform, and her hands were always red from scrubbing dishes. Still, she came home each night with a tired smile and tucked Ethan into bed, as if nothing in the world was wrong. He never asked much about his father, though the question sat on his tongue for years. In school, when other kids bragged about fishing trips or baseball games with their dads, Ethan kept quiet. He'd lower his eyes, push his hands into his pockets, and pretend it didn't bother him. But it did. It always did. Every now and then, on Sunday evenings, he would catch his mother sitting by the window. Her face was soft but distant, her fingers folding and unfolding a slip of paper she never let him see. Sometimes her eyes glistened, though she never cried in front of him. To Ethan, she seemed like someone waiting for a knock that never came. He thought it was just loneliness. He thought she was dreaming of a life she never had. Only later would he learn that those silences weren't empty at all. They were filled with secrets she had chosen to carry alone. Standing outside the mansion now, Ethan felt the weight of those years pressing on him. His mother had tried to protect him from a truth she believed was too heavy for a boy to carry. But what she didn't realise was that the silence itself had been heavier than the truth could ever be. And the folder in his hands was proof that he was more than just the forgotten son. It was proof that her secret was real and that it could no longer stay hidden. After his mother passed, Ethan spent days sorting through the small apartment they had shared. Every corner of the place held pieces of her life. Old cookbooks with grease-stained pages, pay stubs from the diner folded neatly into envelopes, photographs tucked into the backs of drawers. Cleaning it all out felt like erasing her little by little, and each item he packed away left a hollow ache in his chest. It was in the back of her closet under a pile of worn blankets that he found the wooden box. The surface was scratched, the lock rusted, as if it had been moved from hiding place to hiding place over the years. Ethan set it on the floor and knelt beside it, his fingers trembling as he pried it open. Inside lay the truth she had carried alone. There were hospital records, yellowed but intact, bearing his mother's name alongside that of another, the man whose house Ethan now stood before. There were photographs too, faded with time, showing his mother younger, smiling beside a man in a tailored suit whose face looked hauntingly familiar. And at the bottom, folded carefully, was a letter addressed to that man. The ink had faded, but the words were clear. He deserves to know his son. I cannot keep this from him forever. Ethan read it over and over until the words blurred. His chest felt tight, his hands numb. All the years of silence, all the unanswered questions, it had been here the whole time, hidden in a box beneath a blanket. But Ethan knew the world wouldn't take his word for it. So he carried the box to a lawyer his mother had once trusted. In a small office lined with law books and photographs of past clients, the lawyer spread the documents across his desk. He examined the hospital records, compared the signatures, traced the embossed seal still faintly visible on the paper. He studied the photos and the letter, nodding slowly as he pieced them together. When he finally leaned back, his expression was grave. "Ethan," he said, "these aren't forgeries. What you have here is real. If this ever went to court, you'd have a case." For a moment, Ethan just sat there, unable to speak. The proof was in his hands, undeniable and heavy. It should have felt like victory, but instead it felt like a burden. Because even with the truth laid bare, one fact remained unchanged. When the will was read, his name was nowhere to be found. To them, he still didn't exist. The morning felt colder as Ethan walked the last block toward the mansion. He kept the folder tight against his chest, the corners digging into his skin through the thin fabric of his shirt. His mind replayed the lawyer's words. What you have here is real. But the truth felt fragile in his hands, like it could still slip away if he didn't protect it. When he reached the iron gates, he froze. They stretched high above him, the bars casting long shadows across the pavement. Beyond them, the driveway gleamed, lined with polished cars and fresh flowers arranged near the front steps. The house itself looked untouched by grief, its windows shining as if nothing inside had changed. Ethan swallowed hard and stepped closer. His shoes scuffed against the concrete, the sound small and out of place in a world so carefully kept. That was when the guard appeared. Tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform pressed sharp, he walked toward Ethan with measured steps. "Can I help you?" the guard asked, though his tone carried no real invitation. Ethan shifted the folder in his arms. "I need to speak with the Whitmore family," he said quietly, but with a firmness that surprised even him. "It's about Mr. Whitmore." The guard's eyes narrowed. "This is a private gathering, only invited guests." Ethan opened the folder, pulling out one of the documents with trembling fingers. "I have proof," he said. His voice cracked, but he forced the words out. "I'm not here by mistake." The guard didn't even glance at the paper. He folded his arms, his face unreadable. "I'm telling you, you're not on the list. Turn around and leave." The words cut deeper than Ethan expected. For years he had lived with the silence of being unseen, but hearing it spoken out loud, "You don't belong, you're not one of us," brought the weight crashing down all over again. He looked back at the folder in his hands, his mother's letters, the hospital records, the photographs. They were all real. But standing here, with the gate shut tight and the guard's cold stare fixed on him, it felt like none of it mattered. For a moment, Ethan thought about leaving, about sparing himself the humiliation, walking back down the street and letting the secret die in silence. But another voice rose inside him, stronger than his doubt. The voice of the boy who had once asked why his father never came and never got an answer. Ethan squared his shoulders, his grip tightening on the folder. He wasn't going to walk away, not this time. If the gate wouldn't open for him, then he would make sure they had no choice but to hear his name. While Ethan stood outside gripping his folder, life inside the mansion carried on as if nothing beyond the gates mattered. The living room was filled with relatives, their voices weaving together in sharp tones that carried beneath the polished chandeliers. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and lilies, flowers arranged that morning by the staff to honour the man they had lost. But grief wasn't the loudest presence in the room, greed was. An uncle leaned against the fireplace, speaking with authority about what he believed the will meant. "Father made his wishes clear," he said firmly. "There's no need for debate." A cousin lounged on the leather sofa, scrolling through her phone, pretending not to listen but hanging on to every word. Another relative whispered in the corner about property, about investments, about who would end up with what. At the centre of it all sat Margaret, the eldest sister. Her pearl necklace rested perfectly against her collar, her voice crisp as she announced, "Everything is in order. We should not expect any surprises." Her tone carried the weight of finality, as if her words alone could close the matter. But Clara, her younger sister, wasn't so certain. She sat near the window, her teacup trembling slightly in her hand. Her eyes wandered outside, more to escape the arguments than to join them, and that was when she saw him. A figure at the gate. The morning light caught his face, and Clara's breath stalled in her throat. For an instant she thought she was seeing a ghost, the jawline, the steady eyes, the way he carried himself. It was her brother all over again, younger, rawer, but unmistakable. Her fingers tightened around the teacup until she feared it might break. Memories flooded in, whispers from years ago, rumours she had tried to bury, a secret she had chosen not to chase. She blinked, trying to steady herself, and forced her gaze back into the room. "It's nothing," she muttered quickly, interrupting a cousin who had noticed her pause. She set the teacup down, her hand shaking as she reached for a napkin to cover it. Just someone passing by, but she knew it wasn't nothing. The face at the gate wasn't a stranger's, it was a mirror of the man they were all here to mourn. Clara sat quietly, her lips pressed tight, while the others continued their talk of money and possessions. On the outside, she looked composed. On the inside, her heart raced with the fear of what would happen if the truth she had just seen could no longer be ignored. Because sometimes the past doesn't knock politely. It stands at your gate, waiting to be let in. Outside the gate, Ethan stood still, his arms wrapped tightly around the folder, as if it were the only thing holding him upright. The guard had gone back to his post, unmoved, and the voices from inside the mansion drifted faintly on the breeze. Laughter, clinking glasses, the casual comfort of people who belonged. Ethan shut his eyes and the sound dragged him backward in time. He saw himself as a boy again, sitting cross-legged on the threadbare carpet of their apartment, the TV flickering in front of him. On the screen, his father appeared in a news segment, smiling as he shook hands at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The camera flashes made him look untouchable, larger than life. Beside Ethan on the couch, his mother sat quietly, her diner uniform still smelling faintly of coffee and grease. She didn't say a word, but her eyes stayed fixed on the screen. "Why doesn't he come for me?" Ethan had asked once, his small voice breaking the silence. His mother's fork had frozen halfway to her mouth. For a long time she didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but heavy. Some truths are too heavy for a child to carry. Back then, Ethan hadn't understood. Now he did. She hadn't been hiding the truth. She'd been trying to protect him from the pain of being unwanted. But the silence had been its own kind of pain. Ethan's grip on the folder tightened until his knuckles turned white. He remembered her last days in the hospital, the way she had reached for his hand with all the strength she had left. "Don't go looking for him," she had whispered. "It will only break you." And yet, here he was, standing at the very place she had warned him to avoid. He wasn't here to chase wealth. He wasn't here for the things they were fighting over inside those walls. He was here for something simpler and somehow harder. He was here to be acknowledged. The folder pressed against his chest like a heartbeat. His mother's silence had shaped him, but it was the truth in his hands that would define him now. If this gate never opened, he would make sure his voice carried past it. Ethan stood at the gate, the folder pressed tight against his chest, his mother's words echoing in his mind. For years he had lived with the silence she left behind, but silence had given him nothing. Not answers, not peace, and certainly not the recognition he had always craved. His throat was dry, but his anger and hurt burned hotter than his fear. He stepped closer to the gate, the iron bars cold against his hands, and let the words rise from a place he had buried long ago. "My name is Ethan Whitmore." His voice cracked at first, but it carried, strong enough to bounce off the mansion walls. "I am his son." The sound sliced through the quiet morning. For a moment, everything inside the property stilled. The faint laughter stopped. The clinking of glasses went silent. Curtains shifted in the windows and shadows moved across the porch. The guard cursed under his breath and moved toward Ethan quickly. "Lower your voice," he ordered, his tone sharp, as if he could push Ethan's truth back down with sheer authority. But Ethan didn't lower it. His voice grew louder, steadier, fueled by years of being ignored. "You can lock your gates, but you can't erase me. I have proof." He lifted the folder high above his head, the papers inside fluttering as the breeze caught them. "He may never have spoken my name, but it doesn't change who I am. I am his blood. I am his son." The guard reached to pull the folder down, but the front doors of the mansion opened wide before he could. Relatives stepped out onto the porch, their expressions sharp with confusion, annoyance, and something else, unease. One younger man smirked, muttering something cruel under his breath. But an older woman on the steps froze, her face paling as she locked eyes with Ethan. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. For the first time, they weren't looking through him, they were looking at him. And in that moment, as silence stretched heavy between both sides of the gate, Ethan knew the truth had finally forced its way into their world. The front steps filled quickly as more relatives poured outside. Their polished shoes clicked against the stone, their voices sharp with irritation. To them, Ethan was nothing more than an interruption, an unwelcome shadow at a gathering meant for themselves. One man pushed through the group and strode toward the gate. Ethan recognized him instantly, the uncle he had seen in old newspaper photos standing beside his father at business events. Broad-shouldered, stern, his presence carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. "What kind of stunt is this?" the uncle barked. His eyes narrowed on Ethan, full of disdain. "You don't belong here." Ethan's hands trembled, but he held the folder high. "I have proof," he said, his voice steadying. "I have every right to be here." The uncle's lip curled. With a sudden move, he reached through the bars and snatched the folder from Ethan's grasp. Pages spilled loose, rustling in the breeze. He held it up like it was worthless. "This?" he scoffed. "This is nothing but paper. You think scraps of paper can make you family?" His voice rose as he shook the folder, a page tearing at the corner. "You're a mistake, and mistakes don't get a seat at this table." "No!" Ethan shouted, lunging forward, his hands gripping the bars. His chest burned as he saw the documents, his mother's handwriting, the photographs, the hospital records, dangling between them, as if one careless tug could erase them forever. "Don't you dare!" His voice cracked with desperation. "That's all I have." The guard stepped in, pressing Ethan back, but Ethan refused to release his grip on the bars. His knuckles whitened, his body straining against the man who shoved him. Then a voice cut through the chaos. "Stop this!" It was Clara. She had come down from the porch, her face pale, her hands trembling as she pointed at Ethan. Her voice wavered, but it carried a force that silenced the others. "Look at him. You can't stand there and pretend you don't see it. He looks exactly like my brother." The uncle froze, the torn page fluttering in his hand. The others shifted uncomfortably, whispers dying in their throats. One by one, their eyes turned back to Ethan. The air felt heavy, charged with something none of them could deny. Ethan steadied his breath, his voice low but unshakable. "I'm not leaving until the truth is spoken." And in that silence, with the family staring back at him, the truth pressed harder than any gate could keep out. The uncle's hand tightened on the torn page, but Clara's words had already struck like a stone thrown into still water. Ripples spread through the group on the steps, unsettling the careful order they had tried to keep. "He doesn't belong here," the uncle snapped, his voice sharp and angry. He shoved the folder back through the bars as if tossing away trash. "All he wants is money." "That's not true," Clara said, stepping forward. Her eyes burned as she glared at him. "You know what I see when I look at him. You do too. Stop pretending." Murmurs erupted at once. A cousin hissed, "If this gets out, it'll be in the papers tomorrow." Another muttered, "There's no way he's lying. Look at him." Voices overlapped, rising higher, some accusing, some doubting, some afraid. Ethan bent down, gathering the loose pages scattered on the ground. The folder was battered, edges torn, but he held it close to his chest again. His voice cut through the noise, hoarse but steady. I've lived without your money all my life. I don't need it now. What I need is the truth. I won't let you erase me." The shouting dulled for a moment, as if his words had stripped the air of excuses. And then, from the edge of the group, came the sound of quiet sobs. Everyone turned. It was Eleanor, the youngest sister of the man they were mourning. Her silver hair caught the light as she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Tears spilled freely, her shoulders shaking. "I knew," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I knew there was a child. I knew. And I stayed silent because I was scared of what it would do to us." Her words tumbled out between sobs, years of guilt breaking free. "I thought keeping it hidden would protect this family, but all it did was leave us with shame." The porch fell quiet. The uncle looked away, his jaw clenched, but his face pale. The cousins dropped their gazes, no longer laughing, no longer mocking. Ethan's throat tightened as he met Eleanor's tearful eyes. For the first time, someone from that house had said the truth out loud. It didn't make him part of their family, not yet, but it made him visible. And that was more than he had ever been allowed to be. In that moment, the fight was no longer about inheritance. It was about years of silence cracking open, about a secret that could no longer be buried. The argument on the steps faded into uneasy silence. No one had the courage to speak after Eleanor's confession. The family stood divided, some glaring at Ethan with suspicion, others too shaken to meet his eyes. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. Ethan stood outside the gate, the torn folder clutched against his chest. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had just happened. For years he had lived as if he were invisible, but now the silence was broken. They had heard his name, they had seen his face, and one of them had finally admitted the truth. He could have stayed longer, shouted louder, demanded more, but he didn't. His mother had carried her secret in silence for too long, and Ethan knew he didn't want to carry his life that way anymore. He wasn't here to beg. He wasn't here to fight for scraps. He was here to be acknowledged, and that had already begun. With a steady breath, Ethan turned and walked away from the gate. His steps were slow but sure, each one lighter than the last. The sun caught on the folder in his arms, and though it was battered and torn, he held it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Behind him, the mansion loomed, its tall windows reflecting the morning light. On the second floor, hidden behind a curtain, Clara stood watching. Her face was pale, her eyes red, but her hands were steady. In them she held a folded document, an older version of the will, one she had kept tucked away years ago. Her gaze followed Ethan until he disappeared down the street. She whispered something no one else could hear. Maybe it was his name. Maybe it was an apology. Then she looked down at the document in her hands, the paper worn with time. Ethan didn't know it yet, but the truth he had fought to speak had already planted itself inside those walls. Secrets could be buried, but they never disappeared. They waited, they lingered, and sooner or later they always found their way back to the surface. And as Ethan walked away, he carried something stronger than any inheritance. He carried the proof that he could no longer be erased. Sometimes the truth is heavier than silence, but silence can wound even deeper. Ethan's story reminds us that recognition, dignity, and being seen matter more than wealth ever could. So here's a question for you. If you were in Ethan's place, would you have walked away once they finally heard your name, or stayed to fight until they accepted you? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again in the next story here on Rain Inside.